VIridian, the Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 58, Communication. Izuku felt slightly ridiculous as he clambered over the rooftops. He'd taken a week off after his somewhat disastrous last meeting with Eraserhead because, as much as he hated to admit it, Eraser had a point, at least on some level. Izuku had been using vigilantism as a coping mechanism, and not a very good one at that. And even if he couldn't be a real hero because he was quirkless, Eraserhead was right. He couldn't keep doing things the same way he had been. Something had to change. First of all, he couldn't abandon Danky and Mom. It still felt like a dream, but after spending over an hour crying in Danky's arms just because Mom had noticed he was upset and invited his friend over so he wouldn't have to be alone, Izuku couldn't deny anymore that they actually cared about him. It was weird, but he was determined to get used to it, which meant that he couldn't keep fighting recklessly the same way he had been. He couldn't break his promise and leave them alone. Second, he couldn't get caught by the heroes. Things were going to be a bit more difficult now that everyone would actually be trying to catch him, but Izuku didn't know what else he could do. It wasn't as if they would actually let him join the vigilante rehabilitation program once they knew who he was. Like he'd told Eraserhead, being a vigilante was really the only way for a quirkless Deku like him to be useful. So if he was going to continue being VIridian without dying or getting caught, he was going to need to update his gear again. Thankfully, with the UA entrance exam being just about a month away, Danky hadn't been picking up as many shifts at the hardware store, so Izuku had been able to drop by when he wasn't there and buy a few things without his friend getting suspicious. He now had a pair of those noise-canceling earmuffs hanging around his neck, just in case he ran into Amplifier or another sound-based hero, and an extra-strength laser pointer in one of his pockets in case he ran into Eraserhead. At the last minute, he'd even picked up a screwdriver and a holding strap that he'd adjusted to wrap snugly around his arm. The heroes, for better or worse, knew where all of his weapons were, and the tool belt didn't do much to hide them. So, in the event that he somehow got captured, his slingshot, marbles, pipe, and knife would all get taken away fairly quickly. If he wanted any chance of escaping before the heroes got him to the station and figured out he was quirkless, he needed at least one emergency weapon in his arsenal that nobody knew about. Hence the screwdriver, which he could hopefully use to pry open cuffs or take hinges off doors. If worst came to worst, he could always use it as a stabbing weapon. Not that he ever really would, but still, it was only logical to have options. Third, and finally, he couldn't keep going off and investigating on his own. If he had any useful information, he needed to make sure the heroes were aware of it before he moved forward. If they could just communicate better, it should prevent anything like Kohaku's death from happening again, or at least make it very unlikely. So if Izuku thought there was any possibility of danger at all to anyone besides himself, he would give the information to the heroes and let them handle it, assisting only where necessary. He would also be extra super careful from now on to make sure both he and the heroes knew exactly what they were walking into before they attacked. Which was why Izuku was now walking toward one of the places he normally saw Eraserhead, a full notebook in one hand and the laser pointer hidden in the other in case he needed to escape quickly. With everything that had happened with the debut of the Berserkers, Izuku wasn't sure if Eraser had had any more time to look into that lead about the symbol of evil and All for One. So he'd taken all the research he'd done on both that and on quirk transfers in general, and summarized it as best he could in a way that he hoped Eraser and the other investigators would be able to understand. He'd had to write a few research papers for his quirk theory classes online, so he'd basically used that format, adjusting it to fit the information he'd gathered, and included the sources so that they could look deeper in case he'd missed something. But he could only hope all of that would be enough. There was no guarantee that this All for One or someone like him was actually in charge of the villain factory, but it couldn't hurt to pass along what he'd learned. Eraserhead was already there when Izuku arrived, looking over the streets as he waited for any sign of danger. Izuku took a deep breath and shifted his feet, ready to run, but he knew that was more than enough to alert Eraser to his presence. "Hiya, Eraser! Good news! I'm not dead yet!" Eraser glared at him, but Izuku felt a twinge of guilt when he saw the hero's shoulders sag in relief. He mentally added him to the list of people to stay alive for. He couldn't abandon Denki, Mom, or Eraserhead. He would be better for them. "Thanks for the heart attack, kid." Eraser grumbled. "Have you given any more thought to my offer?" "It's not possible, Eraser." Izuku smiled sadly. "Being a vigilante is about as good as I can ask for." "Problem child." Eraser tried. "But I'm going to try to be better." Izuku offered quickly, gently setting the notebook he'd compiled on the ground. "This is all the research I've done on the symbol of evil lead. I'll let you handle it. But I hope it'll be useful. Oh, and I've been kind of hoping this will go both ways. I'll share whatever leads I get on the case, and you share info with me so I don't mess up again. That way we can still work together and keep people safe whenever you're not actively trying to arrest me." "We'd be able to communicate more effectively if you were in the Vigilante Rehabilitation Program," Eraser deadpanned. "So while I appreciate the thought, it's illogical. Why don't you pick up that notebook and we can go over what you found at the station with Detective Tsukachi?" Izuku shook his head and got ready to run. "If I go with you, you won't let me keep helping people." "You'll still be helping people, kid." Eraserhead reacted to Izuku's shift in body language by grabbing his capture weapon. "You'll just be doing it legally." Izuku shrugged. "That hasn't been a problem so far." He rolled to his side as the capture weapon shot toward him, and as soon as he was on his feet, he aimed his laser pointer directly at Eraser's eyes and pressed the button. He flinched back slightly at the bright red light, which gave Izuku just enough of an opening to jump onto the next rooftop. Eraser would have to choose between giving chase and leaving a notebook with sensitive information on an unprotected roof, or delaying to grab the notebook and risk Izuku getting away. It would only be logical to make the safest choice for the investigation, which meant that it was time for Izuku to disappear and go find another crime to stop. Shota swore as he straightened from grabbing the notebook VIridian had left and tried to chase the kid, only for him to have already disappeared. The kid would make a hell of an underground hero if he'd just stopped being so stubborn. He hadn't ever received any formal training as far as Shota was aware, but he was such a fast learner that he'd already become a master of stealth and evasion just from watching the way that the heroes fought. The amount of potential that kid had was almost as insane as the fact that the problem child refused to see it. He sighed and started thumbing through the notebook. He had to admit that the kid was doing things fairly logically. If he wasn't willing to go into custody and actually become a legal hero, increasing communication with his allies was the next best thing to make sure everyone stayed safe. So Shota could begrudgingly admit that the kid was trying. It was better than him disappearing for weeks on end, or avoiding heroes entirely at least. He'd pushed the symbol of evil lead to the back of his mind, since the major concern at the moment were the berserkers, or figuring out ways to stop them. But the kid had taken a throwaway legend he'd mentioned and dug not only into the word of mouth surrounding it, but the quirk theory. He'd handed in the equivalent of a research essay that Shota would have been strongly tempted to use as an example paper for his third years if it wasn't dealing with such sensitive subject. The problem child had even correctly cited all his sources. Shota grew more and more tense as he continued scanning through the notebook. It seemed so impossible for quirks to be stolen, but the kid's research laid it out like the only logical conclusion. The long-term effects the kid had listed out in past cases, where All for One was suspected to be involved, were eerily similar to what the doctors had observed in the berserkers. which didn't bode well for anyone. Who knew? Maybe the kid was completely off and they were dealing with something else entirely, but Shota wasn't betting on it. By the time he'd finished the whole notebook, Shota couldn't do anything except tuck it away into his capture weapon and hurry to the station to bring it to Sakachi. He texted Nedzu to meet him there, since the rat would be able to point out any holes in the problem child's research. But as he ran over the rooftops, Shota couldn't stop VIridian's final paragraphs from playing on a loop in his head. At the current point in the investigation, there is no way of knowing if the villain known as All for One is behind the villain factory and their experiments with Trigger, but it can be logically inferred that the true masterminds are, at the very least, inspired by those stories and have the experience and connections in the underground to be able to import the drugs from other countries, which excludes any small or startup operations. The person or persons behind the entity known as the Villain Factory are well connected and well educated enough to know that quirk transfer is theoretically possible and have the confidence in their abilities to try to make it a reality. Considering that the villains known as berserkers show the same symptoms and side effects seen in other suspected quirk transfers, i.e., brain damage in previously quirkless individuals that later manifested quirks, I strongly suspect that the Villain Factory has access to at least one quirk that enables quirk transfer. It is my opinion that the berserkers are not the final stage of experimentation, but that the masterminds behind the operation are attempting to create a permanently stronger quirk without the brain damage side effect present in the berserkers. If they succeed in that goal, it is likely that they will attempt to create an enhanced individual with multiple quirks. End of chapter.